Many thanks for the opportunity, oops, that was too quick, to share my thoughts on flight reduction in academia. And the outline, what I want to talk about is why do we need to reduce flights? And what does climate neutrality or net zero really mean for science? Who has what responsibility and emotions associated with it? I think these are two really important topics. And the challenge of flight reduction itself and the approach we try to offer with the Flying Less Toolbox. And I would like to finish with the lessons learned and the conclusions. But before I delve in, very briefly, how do I come across that topic? So I've been working on flight reduction in academia since the beginning of 2016. When I was at ETH Zurich, where I initiated, designed, and led ETH Zurich's flight reduction project until autumn 2021. And since October 2021, I'm responsible for the Flying Less network. And what is Flying Less? It's a 3-year project at the IFA Institute, and it's part of the Nationale Klimaschutzinitiative of the German Ministry BMWK. And we try to support academic institutions to reduce their flights, and we have 4 partner institutions and by now nearly 20 associated academic organizations. Now with that, I want to go into a broad, very brief overview. Why do we need to reduce emissions in general? We all know that with the Paris Agreement of 2015, we agreed to keep global warming below 1.5 to 2 degrees. And we know from the IPCC report that already now we have about 1.2 degrees global warming compared to pre-industrial times. If we look at the CO2 budget and we continue with our emissions as now, our CO2 budget would be used up in 8 years if we want to stick with the 1.5 degree, or 25 years if we want to stick with a 2-degree target. We also know that roughly the world population still can emit around 235 gigatons CO2 in order to remain within the 1.5 degree target. And if you break that down, these a bit more than 200 gigatons equally and distributed to each person living in the world at the moment, every person would have a CO2 budget in total of around 30 tons of CO2. So that's not a lot. And that means if one person spends more than 30 tons of CO2 during their lifetime, they use up the budget of somebody else. So somebody else has to use less. And if you just look at one flight Sydney return, that's nearly half the budget already. So I do think we have a problem here. And in particular, if we look at air passenger travel since 1945, which you can see here, there is a gradual and a huge increase in total passenger numbers since 1945. And there were a few dips in between, always an external crisis like the Gulf War, like 9/11, or, for example, like recently, the Corona crisis. But even if you look at the Corona crisis, where I thought there was hardly any flights, or there were hardly any flights at the time, you only have to go back 20 years to have the same number of passengers as in 2020. And I was really surprised about that, because I would have thought, well, we have to go back around to the 80s or something like that, but it's just 20 years. I now would like to concentrate on academic air travel for the rest of the presentation. And I want to list 5 different reasons why I think that the reduction of academic air travel is relevant. And the first reason is that researchers fly significantly more than the average population. The second reason is that a few flyers are responsible for most emissions. And this is a study by Weiss and Donner from 2018 about the flight emissions at the University of British Columbia. They looked at around 1,500 people at 8 departments. And they found that about a third did not fly at all, and that 80% of the emissions were caused by 25% of flyers, and 50% of the emissions were caused by only 8% of flyers. And from the numbers I've seen at other universities like ETH and other universities, it looks very similar. So it's a few who cause most emissions. And I think that's quite interesting if you think about measures, because then you can look at, do you distribute your measures equally to every person at the university, or do you target specific groups more than others? Now, coming back to this inequality of flight emissions, this is a topic in general in other studies, for example, by Görlinger, and that's depicted here that 1% of the world population causes 50% of emissions, while 80% of the world population has never set foot on an airplane. So I think that also shows that it's a very unequal mode of transport. My third reason why I think it's important to reduce flights is fairness. And that's a topic which has come more and more into the discussion over the last few years. And increased air travel has also increased inequality because not everyone has the same opportunity to travel. And that's due to financial restrictions. There are countries who don't have that much money to spend on flights. There are organizations. There are also within an organization groups who have less funding. So it's quite unequally distributed, the finances. There are also visa requirements for some and not for others. There are caring responsibilities. So there are a number of reasons why this increase in air travel has also caused an increase in inequality. My fourth reason is that it's important to lead by example and credibility. That's a study by Attari, and they say that researchers lose public credibility if they do not follow their own advice. And the fifth reason is scientific success. And that's the argument I've heard probably most often. And that's why I like the studies over the last few years looking into the question, how important is air travel for scientific success? And it seems to have a small impact according to a study by Wines on scientific success measured by the H-index, on the number of citations, and on the academic social capital, which means the beneficial academic relationships. However, last year there was a study by Bernier et al., and they do find a correlation between flights and the H-index, but they also raised the question if that correlation also means there is a causality. And they say that, is it that scientists who travel more obtain more scientific visibility and hence get more citations, collaborations, and papers? That would be the exposure effect. Or is it instead that scientists who are more visible because of their work get to travel more? And that would be the reputation effect. Now, looking how significant are flight emissions at research institutions, we collected a number of research institutions, and flights can contribute to as much than more than half of the total emissions of that organization. So I would say it does have a significant lever. Now to the questions, why do scientists fly? And we looked at that in our survey in 2022, last year, and we repeated that survey this year, last year at 8 academic institutions in Germany, and this year at 10. And we asked them for certain reasons why they would fly. And they are listed here in these columns. And we asked them for what is the reason? So what is the significance for you? How much do you fly for that particular reason? And on the left, you can see that conferences are by far the most important reasons. And the very important and rather important reasons are in red and in blue. And that's not so surprising, but we could show it here with more academic institutions than previous studies. So most academics, 90% fly for conferences. So that's certainly the biggest levers. There are other reasons like field research, 40%, or on the left, you can see less frequent reasons like PhD exams or excursions. Now, looking at conferences, there is a very nice study by Klöver et al. From 2020, and they looked at the AGU, which is a huge conference of around 28,000 participants every fall in San Francisco. And they looked at the number of participants of admissions, so they know that 75% of participants have long-distance flights, and to put that into perspective, that accounts for about 20% of the annual emissions of a city like Constance. And what I also like about this paper is that they looked at different measures and they calculated different scenarios. So in dark blue, they looked at how much emissions can you save with the different measures, like moving the conference from the west, from San Francisco, to the middle of the US to Chicago. And that already saves you 12% of emissions. If you use the usual location, San Francisco, but have 70% virtual attendance, that saves you nearly 40% of emissions. If you do biannual, well, it's more than half. If you do the usual location, San Francisco, but increase the virtual attendance by 36%, you already have nearly 80% of savings. And if you do a multi-hub conference with 5% virtual attendance, you have nearly 80% savings. And if you do it biannual with more virtual, you have nearly 90%. If you do it fully virtual, of course, you have nearly 100% savings. And with those figures, we know that we have to do something. We know that it also applies to science, the target of climate neutrality. But the question is, how do you do excellent science in the future under this condition of net zero with a massive reduction of flights? And the question also is, what does science look like in the future? So how are individual science activities and science organization affected? And how to make this transition? And I think most importantly, who is responsible for initiating and steering this process? So this is again the question of responsibility and accountability. And because I find that so important, I have 2 slides on that. Who is responsible for what? And this is a very general overview, and I only looked at the responsibility top down and applied it to flight emissions. So the society and politics, they give targets like a net zero targets, and they apply certain laws to the management of a university or a research institution. And that management then applies certain rules and regulations like travel guidelines, like a reduction target, like a carbon budget, you name it, to the faculty, the department, or the institute. And this reduction target then is broken down to the smaller units and finally to the individuals, and they do the research and the teaching according to the specification. And on the next slide, I want to concentrate on the management and the faculty level and to look at how to do this control. So this leadership level, as I said, sets standards and rules, and they do communicate the norms and rules, they create incentives, and they ensure transparency, which I think is also very important, on the targeted flight emissions. And the staff, the units, the departments, and so on, they adhere to these standards or rules or not. And the leadership level holds them accountable by monitoring the compliance, by acknowledging positive results, and also by acting in case of non-compliance, by training, but also with sanctions. And all this comes down to me in this quote, which is on the right-hand side: in order to prevent unorganized irresponsibility, institutions must be so designed that responsibility becomes clear and can be claimed. Now, the second topic, which I think is really important, because I completely underestimated it when I started the ETH Flight Reduction Project, is emotions associated with that topic. And there can be pleasurable, positive emotions if you fly, but there can also be negative emotions. And if you fly, so that's on the left-hand side, the positive emotions can be pleasure, you can go to exotic locations, you can be far away from home, it can be pride, excitement, relaxation, it can be all kinds of positive emotions. But for some people, flying also has negative emotions because it means stress, loneliness, fatigue, and guilt by being far away. On the other hand, if you ask people not to fly, so we are now going to the right side, that can cause negative emotions like disappointment, guilt, sadness, fear, confusion, but also anger. But for those people who didn't want to fly, it can cause relief. Now, typical reactions can be to deny or to downplay information that is uncomfortable. And we know that from climate issues in general. And a typical argument could be, but the printing paper is much worse. Or have you ever looked at the canteen and at food? And what about plastic and so on? Another reaction can be people get angry, they question your agenda, they say like, oh, this is just an administrative project, and we are not here at our institution to reduce fights. We are here to do excellent science, excellent teaching, and other people should take care of that topic. They might feel betrayed and they might snap at you. For example, a quote like, should we all stop breathing? And I've heard these reactions quite frequently. At ETH, some people, for example, said, I hate flying, but I sacrifice myself because for the good of science. Or only bad or mediocre scientists tackle this problem to hide that they are not very good scientists. So I think it's good to be prepared for the emotional reactions. Now, to briefly wrap up, I hope I could show that we need to reduce flights. That is a huge challenge. And I would also like to show you the flying less approach. So what it needs, I think, is it needs a cultural change. So that is not a minor task. It needs governance and it needs responsibility. It certainly needs a change in framework conditions, and it needs the involvement of all levels, and I think it also needs good data. And we try to support this process in flying less with a website with information fact sheets, with a monitoring tool, and with a toolbox. Briefly, these are screenshots from the website. It's available, the website is available in German and in English, and we have all kinds of different information there. We are on Twitter or X, we are on Mastodon, and we are on LinkedIn. And we have set up a monitoring tool to calculate the flight emissions. It's based on an Excel list. So if you fill in this Excel list with your flight data, you can use that, and we calculate with this Excel list your flight emissions, and you can use these data to see where are your levers and to design your measures. So this is an invitation. If you want to use it, you're very welcome, and it's free of charge and available on the website. We also designed a toolbox. And why did we do that? I think the need to reduce flights is well recognized. And there are several academic flight reduction projects already. But I think a concrete guidance how to tackle it is missing. So we developed an evidence and experience-based flying less toolbox to support academic institutions and also interested scientists to design their own process and to implement the necessary steps. And this toolbox is a set of PDFs, a set of slides on all different aspects. And on the next slides, I want to briefly introduce that toolbox. And I want to start with that with a 1-minute video, because I like so much the drawings of Lucia Fabiani.
Many researchers have a dilemma. On the one hand, they want to be successful scientists and participate in international conferences. On the other hand, they are aware that air travel contributes to the increase of the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere and is thus partly responsible for climate change and its consequences. How can this dilemma be solved? How can science contribute to the net zero goal? In the Flying Less project, as a key element, we have developed the Flying Less toolbox. It contains important information on the topic and a guide for research institutions to successfully reduce their flights. The toolbox is evidence-based and builds on many years of experience. It is an effective tool for implementing the Flying Less motto, successful research, less flying.
So how does it look like, this toolbox? It has 6 different modules. A module on an introduction, why a toolbox and how to use this toolbox. There is a module on a checklist. I'll briefly go into that. There is a module on background and supporting arguments, a module on methods and tools, a module on measures and next steps. You can use each module independently. And for example, if you're already very experienced, you can just skip the background and methods and tools and go directly to the measures. Now, the checklist, I would say this is the core module for me. And it's a list of questions which tries to look at all kinds of different topics, like governance, like the operationalization and so on. And if you go through these questions, you know where you stand and you know who should do what by when. So in the end, it can serve as an implementation plan. There is also a module on the relevance with the facts and figures. And I basically touched on pretty much all of the topics, and most of the slides are from this module. I touched on most of these. Why do we need to reduce the emissions? What are the net zero targets, responsibility? There are some more topics like student flights, technological solutions, and the conclusions as well. There is a module on framework conditions regarding travel, and I define framework conditions as those that can influence travel decisions in academia by setting limits for them. They can be shaped and changed, and they can be differentiated according to the internal framework conditions. This is something which can be influenced by the organization and applies to the organization itself, and external framework conditions, which is outside of the direct sphere of influence, but they can also be influenced indirectly. We also have a guideline on that, which is linked here. Now, the internal framework conditions are, for example, travel regulations, quantitative reduction targets. And looking at these framework conditions, you can ask yourself different questions. So what framework conditions are set by organizations? And how can these be made more sustainable? And what scope do they offer for sustainable individual decisions? For example, do you offer physical participation only, or do you offer a virtual participation as well? Do you offer funding for trains instead of flight, and so on? The external framework conditions, they are determined by politics, by funding organizations, by conference organizers, and by ranking agencies. They can be influenced by joint efforts by the institutions. So you can ask yourself in your organization, which external players do influence our travel decisions, and which can be influenced by our organization, and who within our organization can do that. So who, for example, is a member of a committee, of a society, of an advisory board, so on. And with what other organization can we partner with, and who can provide support? There is also a module on measures, and just want to show you this one slide on that. Measures can be on all different kind of levels, like the management level, administration, research, and teaching. And there are a list of different kind of measures, and you can, if you want to know more, there are more examples within the toolbox. And again, in the toolbox, there are questions to ask yourself when you develop specific measures. What I think is particularly important, where are the levers? So where are most emissions, and which groups cause these emissions? Which existing framework conditions could be changed in the short term, and which ones in the medium term? What new measures do we need? And how do you motivate the organization, individuals, to reduce the flights in general? And what incentives and disincentives do we have? And how can we change them? And what I already mentioned before is, do you differentiate your measures, for example, by status group, by situation, by frequent flyers, or do you apply all measures equally to everyone? And for example, have you broken down your reduction target into the available CO2 budget for different levels? Or is it just very general, we want to reduce our flights? I'm nearly finished now. I want to go through my lessons learned and finish with the conclusions. So my lessons learned are that it's very important to define and to implement responsibilities. I think also that the top-down support is absolutely essential. You need the leadership level behind you. But it's also very important to have the bottom-up support, because travel decisions are made by individuals. So you need to involve everyone. You might not be able to convince everyone, but you should try to involve everyone. I touched on the topic of responsibility. I think it's an individual, an organizational, and a societal responsibility to change the framework conditions. I think we need to address conflicting targets, and there are conflicting targets, and try to create socially acceptable alternatives. I like the term of co-benefits, because there are also benefits of not flying, and they are in the ecological, economic, and social sphere. Very important, I think, is a good database, because it's scientific organizations, so you should argue with your facts and figures. Transparency, I think, is very important. And also the alternatives to physical participation. We all know that most flights in most academic institutions are long-distance flights. For most of them I know, it's more than 90% of emissions are due to long-distance flights. And for those, it's less the question of train instead of flight. It's really the questions, do you go or do you not go physically, and can you participate virtually? And I also think that networks are really important. So to have joint initiatives to be successful. And with the Flying Less Toolbox, we try to support this process. So my conclusion is, we do need a transformation, and this needs creativity and innovation. And science by itself is creative and innovative. So now we need to apply this to the way we do science as well. I think that business as usual is not an option, and that we need different framework conditions to get to this transformation. And we need to take into account that change triggers emotional reaction, and it does take time to get used to, but on the other hand, we don't have that much time left. So I think we need to rethink our current system, and we need a change in values and culture. And we've just published a paper which appeared recently in NPC Climate Action.